Stephanie, thank you so much for talking to me once again. So you've had a situation where it's estimated some 7,000 out of 10,000 voting machines that are meant to be used on election day in Kinshasa have now been damaged by this fire. There's been a situation where police have opened fire on, activists in 2 cities in the DRC. Will this election even take place?
I think the fact that we're asking the question tells us a lot about the credibility of this particular electoral campaign. And one of the reasons, of course, that we are skeptical about the government's willingness to actually hold this election is that it is now 2 years delayed. We also have, as you mentioned, have had significant crackdowns on opposition campaigning. In the previous months, we've had significant crackdowns on opposition marches. We don't have a level playing field. And I think the fact that people are jumping to conclusions about what caused this fire is a really good indicator of just how distrustful people are of the government and of the Independent Electoral Commission.
In fact, the word from the opposition activists is one of suspicion that this fire that so conveniently or inconveniently destroyed voting materials could be employed to try and get the elections postponed. These elections are already late as it is because they were meant to have happened in November 2016.
Absolutely. And again, it's a question of just how much distrust is out there. Kabila spent a very long time keeping people waiting to announce that he wouldn't stand for a third mandate. We only learned that in August this year. That was a very significant contributing factor to the environment of distrust. The exclusion of key political leaders like Jean-Pierre Bemba and Moise Katumbi. And this week, what we've seen in the campaigning environment, where we've had 6 civilians shot and killed by security forces around campaigns. I mean, these are the kinds of things that give you pause and make you wonder what kind of an environment the Congolese government really wants to create around this particular election.
But how much of a watershed moment is this, Stephanie? Joseph Kabila coming to power in 2001 and serving a good 17 years, even extending from 2016 beyond the constitutionally mandated period. Now, this is the end of an era for the DRC in a way. How much is at stake here?
Look, I think that everything is at stake here. This is the first time, as you pointed out, that we're going to have a change in leadership since 2001 when Joseph Kabila took over from his father after his assassination. So it is an absolutely significant election. It's also the 3rd election since the transition period between 2003 and 2006. And we have a very vocal opposition. We have a very vocal civil society in the DRC. We've seen that for the last 3 years, these kinds of forces have gone out into the streets repeatedly, have pushed back against what they see as attempts by the government to delay the elections or to manipulate the outcome of the elections. So this election is essential. I think it's essentially a battle between the status quo, which many are very unhappy with and which hasn't really lifted the quality of life for most Congolese, and a future for Congo where it can look forward, and move away from the kinds of political crises that we've seen over the last 2 decades.
That's a nice way of framing it, Stephanie, the contest between the status quo and perhaps some change. And in terms of how it then manifests in terms of personalities, it is between Emmanuel Shadary who has the backing of the current President Joseph Kabila, Martin Fayulu, and also Felix Tshisekedi. What are your expectations there? What is the appeal of these various candidates as far as you understand the situation?
Look, Ramazani Shadary is by far the least popular, a man without a political base. He's never been elected to office. His highest position he ever held was Minister of the Interior under Kabila. He's somebody who's close to Kabila. And the general interpretation is that he was chosen because he will do what Kabila wants him to continue to do. It's highly unlikely, even according to recent polls, that Shadary can win this election free and fair. Martin Fayulu is the unity candidate. He was chosen in Geneva several weeks ago. Some of the people who had initially chosen him backed out. But Moise Katumbi, a political heavyweight, and Jean-Pierre Bemba, also a very significant political heavyweight from different parts of the country, do back him. And Martin Fayulu has, as a result, the support of the supporters of these key people. And so he is a very viable opposition candidate. Finally, we have Félix Tshisekedi, who has joined forces with Vital Kamerhe. Félix Tshisekedi is the leader of the UDPS. He took over after his father, Etienne Tshisekedi, a veteran opposition leader, a big name in Congolese politics, died suddenly in February 2017. And he has aligned himself with Vital Kamerhe, who's an opposition leader. Many years ago, he was also in government aligned with Kabila. Vital Kamerhe comes from the eastern part of the country. Félix Tshisekedi comes from the central part of the country, and they are an extremely strong ticket, having combined their forces.
So currently, parts of the DRC are dealing with an Ebola outbreak, and the presence of militia groups is something that has almost become a feature that you sort of know that it crops up from time to time, even over the last 17 years. What is your sense of the possibility of staging this election with sufficient participation for it to be considered the will of the people? Can this election happen even in parts like the Eastern DRC, for example, that have been quite tricky over the last few years?
Look, the truth is that the situation in Eastern DRC is certainly different than it was in 2006 and 2011 when the last elections were held, but it's by no means any more violent today than it was back then. And those elections were held, people in those areas were able to vote freely and fairly. So today that particular situation has not changed and should not be an obstacle to these elections being held. The Ebola outbreak, of course, adds a particular new dimension to this particular issue, but it is relatively contained in a smallish area. It should not impact on the vast number of people who are supposed to go to the polls in the DRC on the 23rd of December.
Finally, Stephanie, I guess the last 17 years have taken a visible toll on President Joseph Kabila. I mean, he's grown a beard and he's graying quite a bit. Earlier this week, he was talking about not ruling out any possibilities. He was asked, I think the year is 2022, could he come back as a presidential candidate? Because the Constitution bars him from, holding office in 3 consecutive terms. But I suppose, technically, there's possibility that he could come back. What did you make of that answer that he gave, that he can't rule out anything in the future?
Well, I think in some ways it's an unfortunate thing for him to have done with a candidate who's out there who's not him, and knowing to some extent that there has been great pressure for him to stand back. And so to put himself out there as a potential candidate for 2022 certainly doesn't help the candidate that he has anointed. I think that fundamentally this election is about change. The Kabila elite has been in power since 1997 when Laurent Kabila overthrew Mobutu. There is a great deal of dissatisfaction with how that elite has governed this country. Ramazani is not going to bring change to the ways in which this elite governs the DRC. If we see a Ramazani victory, I think that we will see many different things happening, potentially changes of constitution and a locking down of power amongst the ruling party and amongst the Kabila elite. And that, of course, is what we are very, very concerned about. I think that we've again seen that the Congolese people do not want Joseph Kabila to be their leader at this moment in time. Yeah,
it will be absolutely interesting to watch. Stephanie Wolters from the Institute for Security Studies, we really appreciate your time.